In just 5 minutes, Jasmine Crockett, a black woman, was sentenced to a $15,000 fine with not a single shred of evidence. No debate, no trial, just a pre-written verdict like a mockery of justice. But when everyone thought she'd crumble, Jasmine stood up and presented evidence that left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. What made a lone woman shake the entire system of power? Will justice truly be served? Or is it just an illusion in a society drowning in injustice? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett, a veteran civil rights attorney, had faced injustice before, but never like this. A $15,000 fine for a so-called signage violation felt absurd. Her office banner, "Justice Never Sleeps," had hung in the same spot for 3 years. No warning, no notice, just a sudden citation and a court summons. To others, it looked like red tape. To Jasmine, it smelled like retaliation. Someone wanted her quiet and fast. This wasn't about signage. It was about sending a message. The moment she stepped into courtroom 2B, the setup was clear. The lights buzzed faintly overhead. The bailiff avoided her eyes. The clerk barely looked up. But the real blow, Judge James Boasberg, already seated, already reviewing a file thick with intent. His glare wasn't neutral. It was loaded with disdain. The kind that said, "You've already lost." Jasmine's instincts screamed. This wasn't a hearing. It was a takedown. Boasberg didn't welcome her, didn't ask questions, didn't even glance at her counsel notice. He simply tapped his pen twice and said, "Let's proceed." The prosecutor looked uneasy, like he'd been dragged into something bigger than paperwork. Jasmine scanned the room. No jury, no press, no witnesses, just her, alone, targeted. The message was clear. This courtroom wasn't here to judge her. It was here to break her. Judge Boasberg didn't even look up when he spoke. His voice dropped like a blade. The court finds the defendant, Ms. Jasmine Crockett, in violation of Municipal Code 22F. A civil fine of $15,000 is hereby imposed, effective immediately. The words echoed in the room, sterile and cold, like a pre-recorded message on a machine that didn't care who listened. Jasmine blinked. Had she misheard? She glanced to her left, expecting some acknowledgement of error, some cue that the hearing hadn't actually started yet. But no one moved. No one spoke. It had begun and ended within seconds. The fine was real. The judgment was real, and her right to speak erased. She looked down at the binder in her hands, her statement, her exhibits, her precedents, printed, tabbed, highlighted, all prepared, all useless. Her legal defense had been dismantled before it was even introduced. There had been no request for clarification, no recitation of facts, no room for context, just a robotic recitation of guilt. Jasmine's lips parted to speak, but she was interrupted before she could even form the word objection. Judge Boasberg cut her off with a slight raise of his hand, a condescending gesture that signaled both dismissal and authority. His eyes finally met hers for a split second, not with curiosity, not with impartiality, but with something darker, certainty. Not legal certainty, personal certainty. He had already decided who she was, what she represented, and what he was going to do about it. There was no evidence, not a single photo presented. No citation notice entered into the record. No inspector called to testify. The supposed violation of Municipal Code 22F, allegedly related to the dimensions of her office sign, was treated as if it were gospel, without the slightest effort to prove it had occurred. Jasmine had practiced law for years. She knew what a weak case looked like. But this wasn't weak. It was empty, hollow, built on nothing but arrogance and abuse of authority. And yet no one in the courtroom flinched. The clerk continued writing as if this were standard procedure. The bailiff stood like a statue. The prosecutor, David Lindstrom, sat 2 tables over, fidgeting with his pen, visibly uncomfortable. His lips parted as if to say something, but he stopped himself. He looked from Boasberg to Jasmine and back again, then lowered his eyes to his folder. He knew this was wrong. But he also knew better than to challenge it. Not here. Not with that judge. The fine had been dropped like a bomb. Swift, unexplained, and absolute. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't the type to panic. She was the type who lit matches in rooms full of gas and knew exactly when to strike. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch, slam a fist, or ask permission. Instead, she turned, calmly, deliberately, to the court stenographer. Her voice so composed it sent a chill down the spines of those listening. Please read back the judge's last statement. Precisely, every word. The courtroom shifted, not in chaos, but in stillness. Like the air had suddenly thickened. Like the building itself had realized something irreversible had been set in motion. The stenographer paused for half a second, eyes flicking nervously toward Judge Boasberg, who gave a small nod, barely concealing his irritation. Her fingers returned to the keys. The court finds the defendant in violation of Municipal Code 22F. A civil fine of $15,000 is imposed. The law is clear, and no further argument is necessary. The last sentence echoed like a slap. Jasmine absorbed it in silence, then turned back to the bench, not rushed, not hesitant, but with the poise of someone sharpening a blade behind her back. Her face betrayed nothing, but in her eyes, fire. Your Honor, she said, her tone low but cutting with precision. Just so I'm absolutely clear, are you stating on record that a citizen of this country can be penalized $15,000 without the presentation of evidence, without witnesses, without the opportunity to speak? Are you saying that the mere word of a single city employee, unaudited and unsupported, is enough to render a verdict in this court? For a long, breathless moment, the room didn't move. It was as if Jasmine's words had triggered a silent alarm, one that everyone heard but no one knew how to respond to. A man in the third row, who had been slouched with arms crossed, slowly lifted his head. Two elderly women near the back exchanged looks, whispering just barely above a breath. People who had entered the courtroom expecting another dull municipal hearing now sat up straighter, drawn into something electric. They weren't watching a proceeding anymore. They were watching a reckoning unfold in real time. The prosecutor, David Lindstrom, froze, his hand still hovering over a folder he had no intention of opening. His eyes darted to Boasberg, then to Jasmine, then back again. His posture stiffened, his jaw tightened, as if silently calculating the risk of speaking. The muscles in his neck twitched. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He was part of the machine, and the machine was jammed. Meanwhile, the court clerk, who had been diligently typing away just minutes earlier, suddenly faltered. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, suspended mid-motion like a pianist forgetting the next note. She looked to the judge, waiting for a cue that didn't come. Even the bailiff, a man built like a wall, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes, previously glazed with routine, now tracked Jasmine closely. Tension thickened in the room like fog rolling in from nowhere. Jasmine could feel it. Not fear. Focus. Everyone was awake now. Awake to the absurdity. Awake to the imbalance. Awake to the power Jasmine had just yanked back into her hands by doing the one thing no one else dared. Ask the right question out loud. Judge James Boasberg exploded, not with a tremor but with a thunderclap. His hand came down on the bench with such force the sound echoed off the marble walls like a rifle shot. The wooden gavel stand jumped, a pen rolled to the floor, and every head in the room jerked in his direction. His face, normally stone-cold and unreadable, was now a portrait of fury. Eyebrows furrowed into a brutal arch. Jaw clenched tight. Lips curled back as if he'd been struck in the face. But he hadn't been struck. He'd been challenged. And for a man like Boasberg, that was far worse. He leaned forward, knuckles pressed white against the bench, voice shaking with rage barely kept in check. Ms. Crockett, he hissed, the name now a weapon, not a title. You will not turn this courtroom into a stage for your political theater. This is not a debate club. This is not law school. This is my courtroom, and you do not get to question the foundation of my rulings. The gallery went dead silent. Even the ventilation hum seemed to fade beneath the sheer force of his voice. His eyes burned into Jasmine, his finger rising, shaking slightly from adrenaline, and pointing directly at her like the barrel of a loaded gun. "You are out of line, entirely. If you keep this up, I will hold you in contempt. I will have you escorted from this courtroom by security. Right now, if I must." His voice was louder now, no longer measured. It cracked with emotion, with ego, with fear of losing control. "Do you understand me? This is not a place for self-righteous rhetoric. This is a court of law, and I am the law here." A court officer shifted near the wall, clearly waiting for the signal. The stenographer's hands had gone still again. The prosecutor stared at the desk like a man who didn't want to be seen. And yet Jasmine stood motionless, not blinking, not backing down. She didn't raise her voice, didn't meet his anger with her own. She simply stared at him, steady, unshaken. And that, more than anything, enraged him further. Because in that moment, everyone in the room could see the truth he couldn't hide. He wasn't in control anymore. His shouting didn't restore order. It only made the cracks in his authority more visible. And Jasmine, she knew it. She had seen this before. Not just in courtrooms, but in the eyes of powerful men when someone finally dared to speak the thing they never expected to hear. "No, you don't get to silence me." She didn't blink, didn't flinch, not even a twitch of her fingers. Jasmine Crockett stood tall, silent, steady, like marble carved by resistance itself. Her eyes didn't just meet Boasberg's fury. They studied it, absorbed it, then passed right through it, as if it were smoke and nothing more. She took one breath, controlled, deliberate, and then responded. Not with volume, not with emotion, but with the kind of clarity that makes the room lean forward. "I'm not questioning the authority of this court, Your Honor," she said, each word sliced clean and measured. "I'm questioning the legality of how that authority is being used." The room froze, not in fear, but in disbelief. It wasn't just the content of her statement, it was how she said it. No anger, no apology, no retreat. Just the weight of truth dropped like a stone into still water. Boasberg's nostrils flared, his jaw tightened again. But he said nothing, because what she said couldn't be dismissed without confirming it. She let the silence stretch, just long enough to command attention, not long enough to taunt. Then she turned to the court stenographer with fluid precision. No theatrics, no drama, just certainty. "Please ensure this entire exchange is included in the official record," she instructed, her voice firm but even. The stenographer, still stiff from the earlier outburst, nodded slowly and adjusted her keys. Her fingers returned to the keyboard with a new reverence, as if what she was now typing might one day be read in law schools. And in that moment, the temperature in the room changed, not physically, psychologically. It felt like someone had pulled the emergency brake on a speeding train. Jasmine hadn't just survived Boasberg's eruption. She had de-escalated it by refusing to play his game. And in doing so, she'd exposed a terrifying truth. The man in the robe didn't hold the room together. Fear did, and now that fear was fading. Boasberg leaned back, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He wasn't relaxed. He was calculating, cornered, trying to reclaim footing he'd lost in front of everyone. If he spoke again, he risked digging the hole deeper. If he stayed silent, he looked weak. Jasmine had backed him into the one position men like him feared most: visible vulnerability. You could feel it ripple across the courtroom. The prosecutor, rigid seconds ago, was now looking at Jasmine with a flicker of something new. Not sympathy, respect. The gallery, once half asleep and indifferent, now sat upright, breaths held. The bailiff's hand drifted just slightly from his belt. Even the clerk blinked longer than normal, processing the fact that power had shifted in real time. Jasmine didn't declare victory. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply returned her gaze to the bench, calm as still water, waiting. Because she knew what everyone else was just starting to understand. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. This was a chessboard, and the judge had just lost his queen. Without breaking eye contact with Judge Boasberg, Jasmine calmly reached into her binder. Her fingers moved with precision, not haste. She wasn't scrambling. She was ready. Every step had been calculated long before she entered that courtroom. From the middle tab, marked in red, she slid out a worn legal brief, its pages marked with handwritten notes and highlighter streaks that told their own quiet story. As she held it in her hands, there was no flash of drama, no grand gesture, just a quiet authority that somehow made the entire room lean forward. She held up the front page with a deliberate tilt so the seal of the court could be clearly seen. "This," she said, her voice low but unwavering, "is Sullivan v. State of Illinois." A few heads turned in the gallery. One older man in the back row shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the case by name. Decided by the Appellate Court of Illinois, 2021, a case where the court ruled, clearly and unanimously, that administrative penalties cannot be imposed without objective, corroborated evidence. The words weren't spoken like an opinion. They were delivered like a legal obituary for the judge's ruling. Jasmine stepped forward slightly, not toward the judge, but toward the space between them, that invisible line where power is usually unchallenged. She tapped her finger firmly against the document. The court found that a civil fine issued without evidentiary support, no photographic proof, no inspection report, no signed witness statement, violates due process under both state and federal constitutional grounds. She flipped to the second page, already open to the precise paragraph, as if she could do it blindfolded. Here it is. Paragraph 2. The absence of verifiable documentation renders an administrative penalty unenforceable, irrespective of the alleged authority of the issuing officer. That line didn't just strike the air. It rewired it. The courtroom, once hushed in confusion, now simmered with something new. Awareness. Awareness that Jasmine hadn't come here to argue feelings. She had come armed with facts. And not just facts. Precedent. The clerk stopped typing again, her eyes scanning the page Jasmine was referencing. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed, trying to remember if his own office had cited Sullivan in past hearings. The bailiff was motionless, hands crossed, but his eyes narrowed. He was no longer watching a defendant. He was watching a legal technician dismantle a ruling in real time. Judge Boasberg shifted in his seat, the first sign of movement from him in minutes. His elbow rose slightly. His lips parted as if to interrupt, but nothing came. Because he knew. Jasmine wasn't bluffing. She wasn't quoting hearsay or spouting theories. She had just dropped the full weight of appellate precedent onto the table like a steel gauntlet, and then she said it, quietly but loud enough for the entire room to absorb. "Your Honor, I don't need interpretation. I have precedent. Binding precedent." That single line didn't just change the conversation. It rewrote the battlefield. The courtroom was no longer a one-way stage for Boasberg to impose authority. It was now a chessboard, and Jasmine had just played a move that forced the king to pause. She didn't sit back. She didn't gloat. She let the silence stretch. Long, controlled, surgical. Because she knew, in law, it's not the shouting that wins. It's the silence that follows when the other side has nothing left to say. The courtroom held its breath, suspended between past and precedent, between rage and reckoning. Judge Boasberg sat motionless for a beat, staring at the legal documents spread across Jasmine's desk like they were physical threats. His fingers tightened against the edge of the bench. His breathing turned shallow. And then, with a sudden fury that seemed to come from deep in his chest, he erupted. "Don't you dare lecture me on the law, Miss Crockett." His voice boomed so loud it startled the court reporter, whose fingers jumped from the keys. A ripple of shock passed through the gallery. Someone audibly gasped. Another person instinctively leaned away. But Boasberg wasn't finished. He rose to his feet, not gracefully, but like a volcano rising through the floor. His robe flared at the edges as he pointed a trembling finger toward Jasmine. "I've served as a judge in this courtroom for over 2 decades. I've ruled on hundreds of cases, issued thousands of decisions. I don't need a civil rights attorney from Washington, D.C., telling me how the Constitution works inside my courtroom." His voice cracked at the end, not from weakness, but from something worse. Ego bruised by exposure. His mouth curled into a sneer. His eyes darted around the room, as if searching for backup that wasn't there. "You think just because you throw out some appellate rulings, highlight a few pages, that you can call my authority into question?" He slammed his palm against the bench again, this time harder, louder, almost desperate. "This is not a classroom. This is not a campaign. This is a court of law, and I, not you, decide what happens here. But the force behind his words rang hollow, because everyone saw it now. This wasn't control. This was panic. His tone was no longer the voice of the state. It was the voice of a man watching the scaffolding around him splinter under pressure. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't raise an eyebrow. And that only made it worse. Her stillness, her silence. It wasn't defiance. It was confidence. It was control. And it infuriated him. The prosecutor sat frozen, hands clenched in his lap, not daring to speak. The clerk no longer typed, eyes flicking between Jasmine and the judge, like a spectator at a match that had spiraled far beyond legal argument. Even the bailiff, usually a pillar of stone, shifted uneasily near the wall, his gaze fixed not on the defendant, but on the man behind the bench. Because for the first time in that courtroom, it was clear who the real defendant had become. Jasmine stood behind her defense table like a fortress. In front of her, 3 case files, Jefferson, Mendoza, and Patel, lay side by side like lined-up charges in an indictment. She didn't pace. She didn't point. She simply let the weight of precedent fill the room, her voice composed, her delivery exact. These aren't fringe decisions, Your Honor. They're binding, reviewed, upheld. In each case, courts across Illinois ruled that the opinion of a code officer, absent evidence, cannot support a fine. Not lawfully, not ethically, not ever. Her words were crisp, clinical, and devastating. Each one drove a deeper wedge between Boasberg and the legitimacy of his ruling. There was nowhere left for him to hide. She could see it in his face, the way his jaw clenched with just a hair too much tension, the way his eyes darted, not to her, but to the desk, to the walls, anywhere but the documents she had just laid bare. The courtroom had grown so quiet it was unnerving. No murmurs from the gallery, no coughs. Just the ambient hum of lights above and the faint, rhythmic tapping of the court reporter's fingers, until even that stopped. The clerk looked at Boasberg, waiting for a signal. None came, because he wasn't reacting like a judge weighing arguments. He was reacting like a man realizing the ground beneath him had vanished. Boasberg tried to speak. His mouth opened slightly, but no sentence came together. His voice, once sharp and commanding, was gone, replaced by silence and something far worse, hesitation. His hand reached for his gavel, then paused. He didn't raise it. He just touched it, like someone checking for an anchor in a storm. His eyes flicked briefly to the court clerk, then to the door behind him. And in that moment, Jasmine understood. He wasn't searching for a legal response. He was looking for an exit. Finally, he cleared his throat. The sound was hoarse, barely audible, like it had scraped through a cracked ego on its way out. Then stiffly, he muttered the words no judge says when they're in control. Court will take a 15-minute recess. No elaboration, no procedural note, not even the usual. We'll resume at... Just those 7 words. Then he stood abruptly, as if staying another second might undo him entirely. His robe swayed awkwardly as he turned and left the bench, disappearing through the chamber door with a stiffness that betrayed what he was trying to hide. But Jasmine wasn't fooled. She'd seen this before. Not in courtrooms, but in politics, in depositions, in moments where power met consequences. That wasn't a procedural pause. That was a retreat, a strategic withdrawal under the weight of undeniable truth. Boasberg needed time, not to clarify his position, but to rebuild it. Time to call someone, to skim through Sullivan, Jefferson, Mendoza, Patel, anything that could help him patch the hole in his ship before it sank completely. Around her, the courtroom remained frozen. The prosecutor rubbed his temple with slow, deliberate circles. The gallery sat stunned, as if unsure whether they had just witnessed a breakdown or a beginning. The bailiff still stood at attention, but even his breathing had changed. Shorter, sharper. Everyone in the room had felt it. The dynamic had shifted completely and irreversibly. Jasmine quietly organized the files back into her folder, her movements calm, precise. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Because she didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for her. And when Boasberg returned, she knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't be the same man who left. When the chamber doors opened again, the room didn't just react. It tensed. Something had shifted. Boasberg re-entered first, but he wasn't alone. Behind him walked a man whose very posture broadcast rank. He wore the same black robe, but it draped heavier, darker. His steps were slower, but carried more weight. The second he entered, the temperature in the room dropped. Federal Judge Thomas Whitaker. Jasmine had never appeared before him, but she knew the name. Everyone did. His opinions were often cited in internal memos. Rigid, coldly technical, rarely reversed. A man who valued process above people. And now he was here, not summoned by law, but by strategy. Boasberg barely looked at her as he resumed his seat. "In the interest of transparency," he said, his voice steadier now, reinforced by the man beside him, "I've invited Judge Whitaker to oversee these proceedings to ensure fairness and impartiality." Whitaker didn't nod, didn't greet the room. He simply took his place beside Boasberg, hands folded, lips pressed tight, eyes already scanning the defense table as if Jasmine were a patient on an operating table. The silence that followed wasn't reverent. It was loaded. The gallery looked confused. The clerk paused mid-keystroke. The prosecutor glanced sideways like he'd just been handed reinforcements he hadn't asked for. Jasmine sat motionless. She didn't blink, didn't twitch, but she understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about objectivity. It was about optics. Not fairness, but force. Two judges on one case for a procedural code violation? No, this was political, tactical, a message wrapped in black robes. We can outnumber you anytime we want. But something flickered behind Jasmine's eyes. Not fear, not defiance. Something quieter, sharper. The kind of clarity that only comes when you've already expected the worst. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her spine still straight, and let the corners of her mouth rise. Just a little, a half smile, a knowing one. Because power that needs backup isn't as powerful as it thinks it is. The courtroom, however, had turned against her. She could feel it in the air. Two judges now loomed before her like twin pillars of authority, silent and staring. And she, alone at the defense table, just one woman with a binder full of truth and a voice they couldn't quite silence. Yet, it was 2 against 1 now, the system versus the individual. And that's when Jasmine's focus sharpened, not in spite of the pressure, but because of it. She'd seen this tactic before, in union halls and housing rights battles, in backroom deals where a bigger chair at the table always meant someone else was being squeezed out. But unlike those moments here, she had the floor, and they still had to listen. The moment Boasberg gave the nod to resume, she didn't rush. She didn't speak immediately. She let the quiet stretch, long enough for everyone to feel the imbalance hanging in the air. Then, with a voice clear and firm, she said, "It's good to know we've drawn such high-level interest in a case involving a sidewalk sign." A few people in the gallery blinked. One chuckled, then quickly stopped. Even Whitaker's brows lifted just slightly. Jasmine looked directly at him. "I welcome any oversight that ensures due process. But if this is an attempt to outweigh my arguments with titles instead of law, I suggest we proceed, because I came prepared with both." It was subtle, it was deadly, and it was enough to recenter the battlefield, at least for now. Let them come 2 at a time. She would face them the same way she always had, alone, but unshaken. Jasmine looked squarely at Judge Whitaker, her hands resting lightly on the defense table as her voice cut through the room, measured, unwavering, sharpened by experience and something rarer: conviction. "Your Honor," she began, not with deference, but with control, "discretion has always had a place in law, but it was never meant to exist without discipline." Her words didn't rise. They dropped, low and exact, like weights falling into water. The moment we allow legal flexibility without evidentiary standard, we cross a line, from judgment to assumption, from fairness to favoritism, from law to impulse. Whitaker blinked once. A small tell, but Jasmine saw it. She continued, this time turning slightly toward the gallery, not for performance, but because the people deserved to hear what the system hoped they wouldn't understand. You call it discretion, but in this courtroom, it's become something else. A shield to justify punishment without proof. And let's be honest, this isn't the first time that shield has been used to silence someone who asked too many questions. Silence. The kind that wasn't still, it vibrated. You could feel it in the floorboards. Whitaker steepled his fingers, his face unreadable. But Jasmine didn't stop. She wasn't performing. She was prosecuting the very court that stood against her. Even a gray area has boundaries. Even discretion has a legal floor. You don't get to throw out objectivity just because you don't like who's sitting at the defense table. She paused, not to gather herself, but to let them feel the weight of what she'd just said. Discretion without standards isn't justice. It's camouflage for control. Now the audience really felt it. In the third row, a wiry man in his 60s, hands dark with grease and splinters, a carpenter who'd once fought a code violation that cost him 3 months of work, leaned forward, lips parted slightly. It clicked. He'd always suspected the process was rigged. Jasmine had just given him the words for it. Beside him, a woman in a worn military coat nodded slowly, a veteran who had once filed suit over a wrongful land seizure. She lost. She never understood why. Now she did, because Jasmine had drawn the line. This wasn't just one fine. This wasn't just one mistake. This was a ritual, disguised in procedure, cloaked in silence and dressed in robes. Boasberg sat frozen. The very courtroom that had once been his domain had turned into a stage he no longer controlled. Even the clerk's fingers hovered hesitantly above the keyboard, unsure whether she was typing court dialogue or witnessing history. Jasmine turned back to Whitaker. You speak of nuance, and I respect that, but when the facts are absent, nuance becomes noise. And when the burden of proof disappears, so does the public's trust in the law. Her voice remained even. No fury, no dramatics, just precision. Justice is built on evidence, not hierarchy. And then, softer, almost personal, she added, you can wear the robe, but if you ignore the foundation of due process, you don't represent the law. You represent power. Another beat of silence. No gavel dropped. No objection came. Because what could they say? Whitaker looked at her now, not as an interruption, but as something far more dangerous to the system, a mirror. And the people watching? They weren't just watching anymore. They were awakening. They saw it now, clearly, painfully. Not everyone in black robes speaks for justice, and not everyone who stands alone is powerless. Jasmine had just forced 2 judges into silence with nothing more than precedent and principle. Now it was time for the city's accusation to stand the same test. The man who started it all, the one who had signed the $15,000 fine, was about to face questions the system never thought anyone would dare to ask. Bailiff's voice echoed through the chamber. Nathan Ellis, please approach the witness stand. A tall, stocky man in a dark municipal uniform stood up from the gallery with an air of practiced confidence. His steps were brisk and his expression unreadable. But it was the kind of unreadable worn by people who never expect to be challenged. Ellis had testified before, dozens of times, and always unopposed. This, he thought, would be no different. He raised his hand, swore the oath, and took the witness chair like it belonged to him. Jasmine stood slowly. Her movement wasn't for theatrics. It was deliberate, controlled. A lawyer who had walked into courtrooms more hostile than this one. But this time she wasn't facing bias. She was confronting bureaucracy wearing a badge. Officer Ellis, she began, voice even, you're the individual who issued the citation under review today, correct? He nodded once. That's right. And this citation, $15,000, was issued for what you claim was a signage violation on private commercial property? Yes. The sign was too close to the curb. City ordinance requires a minimum 10-foot setback. Jasmine paced slightly, but her eyes never left him. Did you take a photograph of the violation? Ellis paused. No, ma'am, not that day. Did you return later to document it? No. Did you request a second officer or city planner to verify the violation? Number, it wasn't necessary. Did you provide the business owner, my client, with a formal written notice of inspection before issuing the fine? Ellis shifted slightly in the chair. I didn't need to. The violation was clear. I've been doing this job 22 years. I know what I'm looking at. The air in the courtroom shifted. A subtle thing. A flicker of disbelief crossing the faces of several onlookers. Jasmine leaned in, not physically but verbally. So let me summarize. You issued a $15,000 fine with no photograph, no third-party witness, no measurement report, no pre-inspection notice, and no formal documentation of the scene? Ellis looked to the bench, reflexively. Boasberg said nothing. Whitaker didn't move. I followed protocol, Ellis replied, but the confidence was starting to thin. Jasmine stepped forward slightly, just enough to claim space. What protocol would that be exactly? The one where enforcement is based on memory? On estimation? On the word of one man with a clipboard? I know a violation when I see one, Ellis snapped, then caught himself. It was obvious. Jasmine's tone dropped slightly, not in intensity, but in weight. And that, right there, is the heart of this hearing. She turned to the bench, then to the spectators. Because if we allow I just know to carry the same weight as evidence, then none of us are safe. Not homeowners, not small business owners, not even city officials. A quiet murmur ran through the back rows. The carpenter from the south side, whose garage had once been cited for a mysterious zoning violation, sat forward, eyes locked on Jasmine. A retired Army sergeant who had lost a property dispute against the city clenched her jaw. These weren't abstract arguments to them. This was their life. Jasmine pressed on. Experience is valuable. No one is questioning that. But it doesn't override the Constitution. It doesn't erase the need for proof. She turned back to Ellis. You say you knew what you saw, but how does anyone else know? Where's the proof? Where's the record that this violation existed, beyond your eyes and your word? Ellis opened his mouth, then closed it. Jasmine folded her arms. She didn't need to speak loudly. The silence around her was louder than anything she could say. Because here's the truth, plain and simple. Experience is not evidence. Authority is not accuracy. And no citizen should ever be punished based on the unchecked opinion of one official. At that moment, something happened. A subtle tilt. The energy of the room moved. Spectators leaned forward, not just with curiosity, but with recognition. The balance had shifted, not through drama, but through logic, through courage, through someone finally saying what no one else had dared to say aloud. Boasberg adjusted his robe. Whitaker narrowed his eyes but didn't speak. Ellis sat rigid, staring ahead, jaw tight. And Jasmine? She stood still, because she didn't need to move. The courtroom was already moving toward her. The court had shifted beneath her. But this wasn't just about the legalities anymore. This was about something bigger, about the freedom of individuals who were at the mercy of unchecked power. Jasmine could feel it in her bones. The moment had arrived for her to make her stand. Jasmine stood up slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The sharp tap of her heels against the polished floor was the only sound that pierced the thick silence. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout. Her words would do that for her. If this ruling stands, she began, her voice firm, clear and piercing, then tomorrow anyone can be punished for something that doesn't exist. No proof, no evidence, just the word of one person. She paused, letting the weight of the words settle over everyone in the room. The energy was so thick, it felt like it could cut through the air. Jasmine's gaze never left the bench, where the two judges sat stiffly. But her words weren't for them. They were for everyone else, everyone who had ever felt small in the face of authority. This isn't enforcement of the law. This isn't justice. This is a man sitting in a chair with a badge, deciding for himself who's guilty. The courtroom shifted. The eyes of the spectators slowly moved toward her, drawn in by the weight of her argument. She didn't just have the law on her side anymore. She had the truth. Think about it. The small mom-and-pop store that gets fined $15,000 for a sign they never measured. The elderly man who raises his dogs in peace, only to be fined for noise complaints that aren't even real. The retired soldier who, after decades of service, puts up a fence, only to be told it's 2 inches too tall and ordered to tear it down without a single warning. Her words echoed through the room, cutting straight to the heart of the issue. The examples were real. The stories were real. These were people Jasmine had met, spoken to, and fought for. You want to know what's at stake here? It's not just to find your honors. It's the principle that no one should be punished because one man made a guess. That's not law. That's not fairness. She turned to face the gallery, and her gaze swept across the room. She could see it in their eyes. She could feel their recognition. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses to something much deeper. A business owner doesn't deserve to lose everything because one enforcement officer thought something might be wrong. An elderly man doesn't deserve to be fined because someone thought his dogs made noise. A veteran shouldn't have to tear down his property because an official had a feeling it was a violation. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, but every word struck like a hammer. She wasn't just talking about her case anymore. She was speaking for every person who'd ever been wronged by the system, every citizen who couldn't afford a lawyer to fight back. And if you think this is just about a fine, she said, now stepping closer to the bench, then you've missed the point entirely. Her voice deepened, and the courtroom seemed to lean in. Because what you're doing right now, what's happening here, is more than a miscarriage of justice. This is unchecked power. This is what happens when authority is placed in the hands of someone who has no obligation to prove their case. She didn't look away from the judges. You think this is about a minor violation, but it's not. This is about what happens when the people who enforce the law decide it doesn't need to be proved. It just needs to be accepted. The room was electric with tension. The spectators, the clerk, the bailiffs, they were all watching the system crumbling under its own weight because Jasmine had done something no one expected. She was holding it accountable. We don't convict people because we think we saw something, Jasmine continued, her voice now stronger, more resolute. We convict people because we prove something. We use facts, we use evidence, and we use the law to make sure everyone is treated equally, no matter who they are or what they look like. Her words weren't just resonating with the room. They were striking at the very core of what was wrong with this system, with the power structure that had been allowed to rule unchecked. Jasmine turned toward the back of the courtroom and nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. A man, a veteran, shifted in his seat. He clenched his fists. His eyes were wide, understanding exactly what she meant. Next to him, an older woman in faded clothes, who'd once fought a zoning issue with the city, nodded too. They knew. They had lived it. This isn't about bending the law to suit someone's whim. This is about standing up to the system when it tries to treat citizens like suspects just because someone feels like it. Her voice was like a clarion call. It was a statement, not a plea. And if we allow this to continue, if we let this ruling stand, we're telling every citizen out there that the law is just a game where the powerful play by their own rules. And the rest of us, we're just pawns. She could feel the shift. She had them now. Jasmine stood taller, her eyes locking onto Boasberg and Whitaker. The law isn't a tool to be wielded by the powerful. It is the shield of the people. And it's time we reminded this court, and every court across this country, that the law is made for the people, not by the people in robes who think they can rewrite it at will. She let her words fall into the silence, and for the first time, there was no immediate retort from Boasberg. No objection, no defense, just silence, deep and heavy. And in that moment, Jasmine knew she had already won. The courtroom was hers. The gallery understood. The judges knew. And the truth had become undeniable. The room had reached a critical mass of tension, charged with Jasmine's argument, the judge's authority, and the anticipation of every spectator who realized something profound was about to happen. They had watched the system bend, watched a single voice confront it. Now in the aftermath of Jasmine's final stand, the question hung in the air. Would the law serve power, or would it serve justice? Judge Whitaker broke the silence first. He inhaled, a subtle motion that felt like the entire courtroom was pausing for breath alongside him. Then in a voice that seemed calmer than any he'd used before, he said, "I concur with the defendant's argument." His statement was so concise, so measured, that it struck the courtroom like a thunderclap. The city's prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, flipping through papers he no longer needed, as if hoping to find a missing piece that might change the tide. People in the gallery exchanged wide-eyed glances, uncertain they'd heard correctly. A federal judge, siding with the very woman who had confronted two robed figures, unwavering. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Boasberg remained still, his fingers tapping an unsteady rhythm against the bench. The tension wasn't gone. It had simply transformed into a stunned realization that Jasmine Crockett had, against all odds, torn through the fortress of procedural complacency. And now they waited for the final blow from the only man who still held the gavel in his hand. With the faintest tremble, Boasberg cleared his throat. His gaze flicked toward Whitaker, then back to the silent faces in the gallery. Slowly he rose, the black robe rustling like a warning. He lifted the gavel as though it weighed far more than it had an hour ago, and his voice came out cold but even. The court hereby overturns the imposed fine. That single sentence, the simplest possible phrase, carried the power of a verdict that might echo in future cases and textbooks alike. A ripple of disbelief coursed through the room, stopping short of any celebration. This was victory, but it tasted bitter in the air, an acknowledgement that the system had tried to devour someone with no proof. Jasmine's expression did not flare with triumph. She simply inclined her head as if accepting something that had always been inevitable. Though the tension in the courtroom ebbed, a heaviness remained, for everyone recognized that the outcome wouldn't erase the injustice that had led them here in the first place. People began shifting in their seats. The carpenter who'd once battled an unsubstantiated zoning ticket, the ex-soldier who had lost a property dispute under suspiciously similar circumstances, even the bailiff who had been torn between duty and empathy. They all felt it. That intangible wave of relief mingled with a somber awareness of what could have happened had Jasmine not stood her ground. Without raising her arms or cheering, Jasmine calmly collected her notes. Each paper went into her folder with methodical care, as if she were simply filing away receipts at the end of a normal workday. There was no fist pump, no theatrical outburst. She knew that this was not a moment of pure triumph. It was more of a quiet rebalancing, a near miss where justice had almost collapsed. The hush in the courtroom was thick with unspoken gratitude and silent fear, each person wondering how many times before the system had won without being challenged. And in that hush, Jasmine turned, ready to walk away from the place that had tried to bury her under the weight of unearned authority. Her footsteps against the polished tile were measured, echoing in a space that had abruptly lost its predatory edge. As she reached the oak doors, a single voice drew her back. Judge Boasberg's, unexpectedly gentle beneath the strain. "I underestimated you," he said, the words falling into the air with a weary honesty that felt foreign to everyone who had heard his earlier fury. Jasmine paused, turning just enough so that her profile faced him. The gallery watched, breath caught in collective throats, anticipating either anger or pity in her reply. But her expression remained composed, her eyes still holding the quiet flame of someone who had walked through fire without flinching. "You're not the first," she answered, every syllable steady, infused with the calm acceptance of a woman who had been dismissed one time too many. A flicker of something crossed Boasberg's face, regret, respect, or maybe both. And then she faced forward again, prepared to exit the courtroom that, ironically, now felt more like her space than it ever had for the judge who presided there. Outside, the corridor stretched long and empty, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic tension of the courtroom. Jasmine stepped into that space like someone shedding a heavy coat after a storm. She exhaled, letting the hush settle around her, feeling the reverberation of what had just taken place. For a fleeting moment, her mind flicked to the countless individuals she'd mentioned in her argument. Small business owners, retirees, unsuspecting citizens, who might never have discovered they had a right to fight back. She wondered how many times a verdict like today's hadn't been reached, simply because no one stood up, or because no one could. Yet this was not a celebration. It was a reminder, a call to remain vigilant, to keep challenging unchecked authority whenever it reared its head. As she walked toward the elevators, a few of those who had watched the entire ordeal joined the hallway, faces still flushed with the adrenaline of witnessing truth overpower a rigged process. Perhaps they'd pass the word on. Perhaps they'd share the story that justice could still be wrestled from the jaws of complacency. And Jasmine Crockett, no hero in her own eyes, continued forward, knowing the fight was never truly over. She walked out of that courthouse with neither celebration nor fanfare, just a steady stride toward the unknown. But unbeknownst to Jasmine Crockett, true aftermath of her victory would sweep across the country in ways she could never have anticipated, transforming her personal battle into a beacon of change for countless others. In the days that followed her final showdown in Cook County, the outside world began to stir with murmurs of what had happened inside that austere courtroom. A few bystanders, rattled by the sight of one woman standing her ground against two judges, told their friends, who told their neighbors, who told the local press. Then the local press picked up the story in a small column, overshadowed at first by sports headlines, but soon overshadowing everything else when readers latched onto the tale of a colossal legal system, nearly stifling a single individual with no evidence. Suddenly the story spread, jumping from blog to blog, from social media posts to radio broadcasts. Strangers started mailing Jasmine letters, envelopes arriving in battered bundles, their ink smudged but their desperation plain. One letter came from a grandmother in rural Texas, fined for excessive garden decor that supposedly violated a code no one could produce. Another arrived from a rancher in Montana, forced to pay thousands after a neighbor claimed, without proof, that his cattle were damaging property lines. And with each letter, each story, a pattern emerged, a pattern of "I said so," fines and phantom violations haunting everyday people. At first, Jasmine tried to read and respond to each message personally, devoting her evenings to carefully typed letters, offering snippets of legal advice. She'd seen injustice before, but never in such alarming volume. Each envelope she opened was another story of power unchecked. A family-run store crippled by random citations, a retired nurse fined for a fence built on her own property, a war veteran penalized for a makeshift ramp despite having no official building code to reference. The more she read, the more she realized her victory in Cook County had lit a spark in people's hearts. They finally understood that if one attorney could force a judge to admit wrongdoing, maybe the impossible wasn't so impossible after all. And that realization was like oxygen feeding an ember, turning it into a nationwide discussion about the limits of administrative authority. Before long, Jasmine found herself fielding phone calls from law schools, civic organizations, and even local government reform groups, all wanting her perspective on how one stands up to a system that often forgets its own rules. If the courthouse had felt suffocating before, now her office felt even more so, piled high with letters, articles, and invitations for interviews. But Jasmine wasn't overwhelmed. She was galvanized. She saw the desperation in these pleas and understood, with crystal clarity, that the fight was no longer just hers. Then the invitations to speak at universities began, slipping quietly into her mailbox alongside the increasingly personal letters. One such request came from the law department at the University of Texas. A handwritten note from a professor who'd watched footage of the Cook County trial, footage leaked by a court observer's phone, and recognized in Jasmine's calm, incisive manner the perfect model for teaching students about constitutional rights versus bureaucratic overreach. The professor wrote passionately, describing how they wanted to incorporate her case into a new civics and civil rights curriculum, how it offered a ground-level example of how easily authority could slide into misuse when nobody demanded proof. Intrigued, Jasmine accepted, flying down to Texas for what she assumed would be a modest lecture to a handful of curious students. Instead, she arrived to find an overflowing auditorium, professors crammed in the back, students lining the halls, some even sitting on the floor. Many of them carried printouts of the Cook County transcripts, highlighting her cross-examination of the enforcement officer. Others clutched scribbled notes, questions about due process, about evidence, about the constitutional guardrails that are supposed to protect citizens but can fail without vigilance. Standing at the lectern, Jasmine realized that this was the real victory, far more meaningful than any courtroom acquittal, planting the seed of skepticism, of rightful questioning, in the minds of the next generation of legal minds. Her lecture at the University of Texas sparked a campus-wide conversation. Should administrative rulings be subject to tighter evidentiary standards? Were municipal officers being trained or just handed unchecked power? Word of the debate spread to neighboring campuses, and soon Jasmine found herself bouncing between invitations to speak at panels, roundtables, and university conferences. She became a reluctant figurehead of a grassroots wave demanding actual proof for all code-related fines. The press, sensing a larger story, picked up on this surge of curiosity and followed Jasmine's trail. Local TV stations ran segments titled Evidence or Assumption, The Fight for Fair Process, and When the Law Forgets Itself. Podcasts dedicated hours of airtime to dissecting her legal strategy. Her ability to remain calm under withering pressure, her unwavering insistence that evidence is the bedrock of justice, but her days were not spent basking in fame. She was too busy sifting through the tidal wave of new cases, answering calls from retired mechanics, single mothers, and community organizers who saw in her a champion for their own unwinnable fights. At night, she'd collapse into bed, mind still racing, swirling with the stories of real people whose lives had been twisted by arbitrary rulings. And every morning she rose again with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that Cook County was not an anomaly. It was the tip of a far-reaching iceberg of administrative injustice. The climax came one afternoon when Jasmine was halfway through a stack of letters, each detailing a fresh instance of code enforcement gone wild. Her phone buzzed with an unknown number from Washington, D.C. Expecting another local journalist or maybe a nonprofit organization, she picked up, only to hear the voice of a congressman who introduced himself politely, then dove straight into business. "I've read the transcripts from your Cook County case, Ms. Crockett," he said, voice crackling with urgency. "We've been monitoring a trend of unconstitutional administrative fines for a while now, but your case puts a spotlight on how out of control it's gotten." He explained that he was spearheading a legislative effort to mandate strict evidentiary requirements for any administrative penalty. Any municipal or state-level fine would need tangible proof, photographic or otherwise, to be enforceable. "We'd like your expertise," he said simply, "in crafting language that ensures no citizen is penalized on the basis of, 'I said so.'" Her heart pounded. She hadn't set out to change the law itself. She had only wanted to defend one case of injustice. Yet here she was, standing on the precipice of systemic reform. That phone call led to a series of meetings in Washington, closed-door discussions in dimly lit committee rooms where gray-suited staffers took furious notes, and Jasmine's calm, precise voice explained the blow-by-blow of how a person could be fined thousands without a shred of proof. She detailed the real impact these fines had on ordinary people, many of whom never contested them because they lacked the time, money, or confidence to stand up against City Hall. She recounted the transcripts from her own hearing, describing each moment in which the burden of evidence was replaced by the arrogance of authority. For some staffers, it sounded like fiction. Could it really be that easy for officials to penalize individuals with no documentation? Jasmine's answer was unflinching. Yes, it could. Yes, it was happening right now. And if they didn't codify stricter guidelines, the problem would grow beyond the boundaries of any single county or city. More than once, she had to pause to let them process the scale of it. The thousands of letters, the phone calls, the horror stories from every corner of America. Each meeting ended with nods of grim acknowledgement and renewed promises to fight for a law that would force accountability onto local governments. She left the Capitol each time, exhausted yet oddly hopeful, because her personal battle was now something bigger than a single court case. As the proposed bill began to take shape, Jasmine's inbox exploded again, this time with messages of excitement, cautious optimism, and even stark skepticism from those who had been burned too many times to believe in legislative remedies. Some people thanked her for making a difference. Others worried the bill would be watered down by political wrangling. Across the media, headlines started proclaiming new legislation could mandate objective evidence for code violations, and Congress targets municipal overreach. Talk shows invited her for interviews, asking how a single court battle in Cook County had mushroomed into a nationwide movement. She always gave the same measured reply, that it wasn't her alone, but the collective voices of everyday people who had felt the injustice pressing down on them. The public latched on to her sincerity. She had never claimed to be a hero. She claimed to be a lawyer doing what lawyers were supposed to do: defend those who can't defend themselves by shining a light on where the law had been ignored. And in those TV segments, her demeanor never changed, still calm, still unwavering, because the scope of this problem was too massive for triumphal fanfare. Instead, she persisted in telling real stories, names, faces, places, making it harder for politicians to turn a blind eye. Every time a new broadcast aired, more letters flooded in, each voice an echo of the same plea: don't let them forget us. Meanwhile, at the University of Texas and other campuses nationwide, law professors seized upon Jasmine's Cook County victory like it was a case study in how the judiciary could fail if citizens refused to question it. Students dissected transcripts, analyzing how she maintained composure under Boasberg's fury, how she dismantled flimsy evidence, how she used reason rather than outrage to expose a foundational crack in administrative law. Classroom debates raged about whether or not the system could truly reform itself, or if it would always need outside challengers like Jasmine to keep it honest. Some students even formed legal aid societies, offering free advice to local residents battling code violations. Professors reported a surge in interest in public service law, with students citing her hearing as the spark that lit a fire in them. Soon, the name Crockett was spoken in corridors alongside names like Brandeis and Marshall, not for the scale of her achievements, but for the principle she championed: that no judge, no code enforcer, no official had the right to penalize a person without proof. Back in Chicago, Jasmine heard rumors of these movements, occasionally receiving an email from a bright-eyed law student explaining how her ordeal had inspired them to pursue constitutional litigation. Every email stoked her quiet resolve, reminding her that the seeds she'd planted were blossoming in places she might never see firsthand. Finally, the day arrived when the new bill, colloquially dubbed the Show Me the Evidence Act, was introduced on the congressional floor. Crafted with Jasmine's input, the legislation aimed to create a federal baseline for due process in administrative penalties. Representatives stood to speak about the rampant issues they discovered in their own districts. Overdue library fines turned into municipal liens, unverified building code citations crippling local businesses, entire communities afraid to speak up because they assumed the government must be right. Over the course of a heated debate, lines were drawn between those who believed in tighter checks and those who argued that local officials should maintain broad discretion. Yet each time someone claimed the law would hinder municipal enforcement, Jasmine's supporters rose to counter with her testimony, reminding everyone that common sense must always be underpinned by common proof. After hours of back and forth, a vote was called. The margin was close, but the bill passed its first major hurdle. The House of Representatives approved it, sending it onward toward further legislative checkpoints. Outside, reporters swarmed the congressman who'd spearheaded the effort, peppering him with questions about whether Jasmine's case had truly been the tipping point. He answered with a short statement. She reminded us that unchecked authority is tyranny by another name. The cameras whirred, the crowd buzzed, but in a quieter sense, an entire country exhaled, seeing a glimmer of hope that the law could still bend toward justice. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside a packed federal courtroom, Jasmine Crockett refused to stand as Judge Grayson entered. But just 12 days later, he was dragged from the bench in handcuffs by the FBI. She didn't need to shout. One USB drive, and the entire power structure began to collapse. So what exactly did she uncover? So devastating that it made the most powerful men in America go pale in the middle of a live hearing. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courtroom had never felt this tense. From the previous night's headlines to the early morning rumble of protesters outside the courthouse steps, something heavier than law hung in the air. And when the doors creaked open to begin the most anticipated federal trial of the decade, United States versus Hawk Enterprises, an alleged transnational drug empire cloaked in corporate suits, accused of flooding American neighborhoods with fentanyl and bribing everyone from local cops to top-level judges. Jasmine Crockett, White House legal counsel, stepped inside like a blade through fog. She wasn't just here to prosecute a case. She was here to expose a system that had long sold justice to the highest bidder. Every step she took across the courtroom floor echoed with purpose. Cameramen repositioned, journalists murmured, defense attorneys at the Hawk Enterprises table stopped whispering and stared. Even the court clerk looked up, eyes wide, lips pressed together. Something was different today. Then the gavel slammed like a war drum. "All rise," the bailiff commanded, his voice cracking the silence like a whip. People stood, slowly, obediently. Grayson adjusted his robe, his chin lifted in self-importance. And yet one figure remained seated, Jasmine Crockett, arms folded tightly across her chest, her back straight, her chin locked, and her eyes, sharp, burning, unblinking, locked onto Judge Grayson like a predator cornering prey. The silence stretched thin until she spoke with ice in her tone. "I don't rise for a man who sold justice." The sentence didn't just hang in the air. It punched through it. You could hear an audible gasp from the second row. A defense attorney dropped his pen. A camera swiveled violently to capture her face. The judge's eyes flared with a rage he barely concealed. The air inside the courtroom was no longer thick with tension. It was about to explode. People weren't used to seeing the rules bent, much less shattered. This wasn't a protest in the streets. This was inside the belly of the beast, the federal courtroom itself, and Jasmine had just spat fire at the bench. She knew exactly what she was doing. She also knew exactly who she was facing. John Grayson wasn't just any judge. He was a respected, calculating figure who'd ruled over dozens of high-stakes cases. But his name, Jasmine believed, was also whispered in circles where verdicts were bartered like stocks. She had seen the sealed files, the strange dismissals, the curious financial filings. And now she had seen enough. She had no intention of playing by the script, because sometimes the system only bends when someone breaks it. And today, Jasmine Crockett came prepared to be that break. Grayson slammed the gavel again, this time not as ceremony, but as warning. "Miss Crockett," he growled, his voice taut with restrained fury, "this courtroom is governed by order. You will respect it, or you will be removed from it." But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't even shift in her seat. Her voice cut clean through the buzz beginning to ripple across the room. "Order dies when justice is sold." You could hear the stifled intake of breath from reporters scribbling wildly, from paralegals gripping their case files, from spectators barely able to believe what they were witnessing. No one had ever spoken to Grayson like that, not in open court, not without consequences. And yet Jasmine wasn't bluffing. She had the title, the authority, and more importantly, she had the truth. Cameras kept rolling. Journalists tweeted in real time. And in that moment, it wasn't just a trial against Hawk Enterprises anymore. It was Jasmine Crockett versus the system, and the whole world had just tuned in. But that moment in the courtroom, the bold refusal to stand, didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for years, fueled by pain, injustice, and a promise Jasmine Crockett made the day she lost someone she loved. Before she ever stepped into federal courtrooms or the White House, Jasmine was a tough, fearless prosecutor in Dallas, Texas. She worked long nights fighting drug traffickers, going after gangs, shutting down dirty clinics. She saw the damage opioids were doing to families, but nothing hit her harder than what happened to her own. Her cousin Marcus was only 19, smart, funny, the kind of kid who called her Jazz the Giant Slayer because he thought she could take on anyone. One night, he took a single pill at a party. One pill. It was laced with fentanyl. He died alone in a friend's kitchen. Jasmine got the call just past midnight. She didn't cry, not in public. At the funeral, she stood silent, her hand on Marcus's casket, her heart burning with rage. That night, she stayed in her office until sunrise, going through case files of overdose victims. She noticed patterns, same areas, same packaging, same shipping codes. It wasn't just local drug dealers, it was bigger, organized, protected, and one name kept popping up: Hawk Enterprises. When her team told her to be careful, Jasmine said one thing: "I'll follow this trail all the way, through Texas, through Congress, through the White House if I have to." And she meant it. Years later, after leading some of Texas's biggest drug prosecutions, Jasmine was invited to Washington. She became legal counsel to the White House, the highest legal position in the country. But the deeper she looked, the worse things got. Hawk Enterprises wasn't just a drug operation anymore. It had money, lawyers, media connections, and political protection. It was paying off senators, funding campaigns, and worst of all, bribing judges. One of those judges was a name she recognized from a file she'd flagged before: Judge John Grayson. But just when Jasmine thought she had reached the bottom of this rotten system, something arrived that proved she had only scratched the surface. It happened late one night in early autumn. The Justice Department's office was nearly empty, the halls dark and humming with distant security lights. Jasmine was still at her desk, sleeves rolled up, reviewing suppressed case files tied to Hawk Enterprises when her secure email system blinked. A new message had come through. No subject line, no sender name, just one attachment: an audio file labeled "Confidential, Do Not Share." She stared at it for several seconds. In her line of work, anonymous messages weren't rare, but this one felt different. She glanced at the hallway, empty. Then she inserted her encrypted drive, closed all open files, and clicked play. The audio hissed, then cleared. A man's voice came through, low, deliberate, too familiar. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't afraid. It sounded like someone making dinner reservations. Then came the line that stopped Jasmine cold. 500,000. It's already offshore. I'll make sure the charges don't go far. Another pause, then a smug chuckle. For Hawk, I've done worse. Her breath caught. The voice. It was Judge John Grayson. Not a guess. Not a possibility. It was him. The cadence, the phrasing, the slight southern rasp she'd heard dozens of times in courtrooms. She played it again. Slower, louder. There was no room for doubt. A sitting federal judge was caught on tape discussing a payment, a bribe in exchange for shielding Hawk Enterprises from prosecution. Jasmine's heart pounded, not from fear but from fury. She had always suspected Grayson, his strange rulings, the way evidence disappeared mid-trial, the sealed motions that made no legal sense. But this was the first time she had something concrete. Something explosive, and yet she knew the law wouldn't make it easy. The recording was anonymous, possibly inadmissible. Defense attorneys would call it manipulated. Chain of custody didn't exist. Its origin was a mystery, and still, she knew what it was. Proof, not perfect, not polished, but real. The kind of thing you either buried or weaponized. She sat still for a long time, the audio looping quietly in the background. Outside the window, Washington's skyline glimmered like glass shards under the moon. Below, power moved through the streets in silence. Judges, lobbyists, officials sliding through black cars and closed doors. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the edge of her desk. Her career was at stake, so was her safety. But this wasn't about her anymore. It hadn't been since Marcus died. "He took their money," she whispered aloud. "And now he thinks no one will ever know." She turned toward the whiteboard filled with timelines, crime scene photos, offshore bank records, all threads leading back to Hawk. And in that moment, she made a decision, one not driven by ambition or ego, but by a quiet, burning clarity. She would bring the fight into the courtroom, not just against Hawk Enterprises, but against the very bench that protected them. She would no longer wait for the system to correct itself. She would use it as a stage, and Judge John Grayson would be the one under cross-examination. The silence after Jasmine's words still hung in the courtroom like smoke after a gunshot when the inevitable happened. Judge Grayson exploded. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. "Ms. Crockett," he snapped, his voice rising with a venom it hadn't shown in years. You are dangerously close to contempt. His face flushed a deep, angry crimson as his eyes bore into her like twin coals. He leaned forward, both hands braced on the bench, as if trying to physically loom over her from the elevated seat of power. You have insulted this court. You have insulted me. His voice cracked on the last word, not from weakness, but from rage barely contained. If you do not retract your statement and conduct yourself with proper decorum, I will hold you in contempt and order your immediate arrest. The room bristled. A low murmur rippled through the gallery like the pre-shock of an earthquake. One of Hawk Enterprises' lawyers raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly, sensing the judge might hand them a political gift. A camera shifted focus, zooming in on Jasmine's face. She didn't blink, didn't move. She had just called a federal judge corrupt to his face, and now he was threatening to take her down. It wasn't justice, it was retaliation, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She slowly stood up, not because the judge told her to, but because she chose to take the floor. Her movements were controlled, precise. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood as she stepped forward. The air seemed to tighten with every second. She looked straight into the judge's eyes, her tone cold but crystal clear. "Threaten me all you want," she said, her voice carrying through every row. "But I don't answer to a man who barters justice behind closed doors." Grayson's face twitched. The hand holding his gavel shook just slightly. The gallery fell into a stunned hush, the kind that precedes either a historic ruling or a complete breakdown of order. Jasmine was no longer just a lawyer. In that moment, she became something else, a threat to the system itself. The gavel still trembled on its block when Jasmine reached down, calmly, deliberately, and opened the brass locks of her leather briefcase. Her fingers didn't shake. Her eyes didn't blink. Every movement was calculated, surgical. She withdrew a folded document, firm and deliberate, its government seal catching the light with an almost theatrical glint. Then she held it up with just 2 fingers, turning slightly so both the judge and the cameras could see. Her voice dropped, not loud but clear enough to silence every cough, every murmur, every whispered doubt. "If you touch me," she said, her tone cold and surgical, "the full weight of the federal system will touch you back, and it won't stop at your bench." Dead silence, not stunned, not shocked, stilled, like the entire room had fallen underwater. The lead bailiff froze mid-step. His eyes darted to the document, then to Grayson, then back again. He'd seen arrest orders, court chaos, screaming defendants, but he had never been in a room where a White House lawyer stood her ground with a legal shield that could end a judge's career in one blow. Jasmine slowly stepped forward, placed the paper face up on the table, and tapped the DOJ header with a single finger. Federal immunity, departmental clearance, presidential seal. It wasn't a bluff, it was a warning shot, delivered with the professionalism of someone who knew exactly how this game was played and how to flip the table without raising her voice. Grayson didn't speak. His mouth opened, then closed again. The color had drained from his face. Not rage this time, but calculation. He realized too late that Jasmine had come prepared for war. Not a courtroom debate, not a media circus, but a surgical strike, executed with legal precision. Every move she had made up to this moment, the refusal to stand, the direct accusation, the timing of the immunity document, it was all deliberate. And now the trap had been sprung, with every camera in the room capturing his reaction. Behind the defense table, the lawyers representing Hawk Enterprises sat suddenly stiff, eyes flicking toward their briefcases like they were about to reach for parachutes. One of them whispered something into his colleague's ear, too quietly to catch on the microphone, but the nervous energy was unmistakable. They weren't worried about Jasmine's accusations. They were worried about what else she was holding, what else she had planned, what she would release next. Because if Judge Grayson crumbled here, on camera, under pressure, then the entire architecture protecting Hawk Enterprises would come down with him. It was like a spider's web. Every silk thread carefully woven over the years, shady plea deals, campaign donations passed through shell companies, friendly judges, bought-off cops, and silent politicians. But webs aren't made to withstand fire. and Jasmine Crockett had just lit a match. The shift in the room was physical. Everyone could feel it in the air pressure. This wasn't about order anymore. It wasn't about law. It was about power and who had just seized it. Grayson, once the unchallenged ruler of this courtroom, while Judge Grayson sat frozen in his robe, facing down a courtroom he no longer controlled. Far away from the cameras, a different kind of court was in session. In the steel and marble underbelly of Washington's power district, inside a private conference room hidden beneath a luxury media firm's headquarters, 4 men gathered under urgent silence. The door was soundproof, the lights dim, the oxygen thick with tension. Victor Hawk, CEO of Hawk Enterprises, stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back, eyes sharp, posture rigid. Across from him, 2 senior opposition senators, both with reputations built not on legislation, but leverage. And at the end, calmly stirring a glass of bourbon, sat Martin Cates, a media baron whose empire could smear reputations in real time. She flipped the script, Hawk said coldly. Grayson blinked on live TV. And if she's holding that immunity paper, it means she's not just playing the court, she's playing the country. He turned to the senators, gaze steady. If that judge cracks, everything we've built around him collapses. The funding lines, the friendly rulings, the cover. The elder senator exhaled slowly. You think he'll hold? Hawk didn't answer right away. Then he spoke, voice low and lethal. I think he's panicking, which means we act now. The plan wasn't about saving Grayson. It was about saving the structure around him. They didn't need him to win. They just needed Jasmine Crockett to lose. Hawk stepped aside and clicked a remote. A monitor lit up, displaying a slideshow of Jasmine's courtroom defiance. Her standing firm, eyes locked on Grayson, her voice captured saying, if you touch me, the system touches you back. The pause in the room was chilling. She wants to be a symbol, Hawk said. So we break the symbol. Martin Cates leaned forward, steepling his fingers. We'll run a full editorial suite within 12 hours. She'll be cast as reckless, unstable, driven by vengeance, not justice. We use her defiance against her. Federal attorney ignores due process, threatens separation of powers. That kind of language, let the public chew on that, the younger senator smirked. I'll push for a congressional ethics hearing. We'll frame it as a concern for judicial independence. Doesn't matter if it holds up, we just need headlines. But Hawk wasn't finished. From his briefcase, he produced a folder, slim, clean, and chilling. He laid it on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were a dozen photos. Jasmine walking to her car, her niece exiting school, her parents at a quiet suburban cafe, all taken without her knowledge. At the bottom of the folder, a single handwritten note, 4 words. Back off, or lose everything. The silence thickened. Cates frowned. That's a line. Hawk's voice didn't flinch. It's a reminder, not a threat, a psychological leash. She wants to fight like a soldier. We remind her she's still human, still vulnerable. Days passed like loaded dice. The media storms roared. Headlines screamed. Talking heads on television turned her into a villain, then a martyr, then something in between. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't do press. She didn't issue statements. She didn't blink when the threats escalated. She waited, prepared, built her case like a surgeon sharpening a scalpel. And now the day had come. The courtroom was packed again, tighter than the first time. Spectators filled every row, media vans swarmed the courthouse steps, and uniformed officers lined the aisles like soldiers before battle. Judge John Grayson entered first. He wore his robe, but the power behind it had faded. He tried to maintain the image of control, chin up, gavel firm, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew what Jasmine had. He just didn't know when she would strike, and she let that uncertainty bleed into the room like smoke from a fire no one could see. Jasmine stepped forward with calm precision. Her blue suit was crisp, her expression unreadable. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a silver USB drive. Small, harmless looking, but loaded like a weapon. She held it between her fingers for all to see. Your Honor, she said, her voice ringing clear. This is no longer about courtroom theatrics. This is evidence, direct, unfiltered, and verified. Then she handed the drive to the court technician without breaking eye contact with Grayson. This contains audio of Judge John Grayson accepting a bribe from Victor Hawk to interfere in this trial. The courtroom froze. You could hear the sound of a pen dropping somewhere in the gallery. Cameras whipped toward the bench. Grayson opened his mouth, but no words came. His face flushed a shade of red that no lighting could hide. For a full 3 seconds, the court stood on the edge of chaos. Then Jasmine turned to the back of the room and gave a single nod. From the crowd, FBI agent Sarah Clean rose, tall, sharp-eyed, wearing a dark suit and her badge visible. She approached the bench like a blade in motion. "Agent Clean," Jasmine said, "please confirm the integrity of the file." Sarah stood straight, her voice firm. "The Justice Department received this recording via secure drop. We ran voice-matching protocols against Judge Grayson's official interviews and courtroom transcripts. It is a 96% voice-print match. Timestamp metadata confirms it was recorded 2 weeks before this trial began." She paused. "It also matches with known offshore transfer activity linked to Hawk Enterprises, specifically a $500,000 wire to a shell company in Belize. The voice in the recording confirms the exchange." Gasps. Someone in the gallery swore under their breath. One of Hawk's lawyers buried his face in his hands. Grayson's knuckles whitened around the gavel. But Jasmine wasn't done. She stepped forward, her voice low but razor sharp. "That's not opinion. That's not politics. That's evidence. And I am asking this court to do what this court was designed to do. Serve justice, not protect criminals in robes." And with that, the war Jasmine had been waging from the shadows stepped fully into the light. The courtroom lights flickered slightly, not from a power surge, but as if the atmosphere itself had shifted. The screen behind the witness stand glowed faint blue. Then the first sound broke through the thick silence. A slight crackle, then the unmistakable voice of Judge John Grayson. "It's already done. 500 wired, untraceable, offshore." Gasps swept through the room like wind hitting dry leaves. Eyes widened. Some heads turned toward the bench instinctively, but Grayson did not look up. He sat motionless, hands gripped on the sides of his chair, as if bracing for a wave he knew he could not stop. Then came the second voice, Victor Hawk, calm, cold, intentional. The tone of a man who controlled empires, not with fists, but with phones. "Good. Then you know what to do. Keep Jasmine quiet." Whispers shot through the gallery. Journalists leaned forward in their chairs. One cameraman cursed softly and tightened the zoom. The prosecution table went still, Jasmine included, but her stillness was deliberate. Her silence was power. She didn't flinch. The audio continued. Grayson again. "She doesn't scare easy." A nervous chuckle followed, the kind that betrayed doubt, fear hiding behind arrogance. Hawk didn't laugh. His voice turned sharper, more lethal. "Then make her scared. I don't care how. Just silence her. By any means necessary." The line dropped like a bomb. And just like that, the courtroom transformed from a place of procedure to a crime scene. Not just a crime against law, but against principle. Against the very idea that truth could exist safely within the walls of power. In the jury box, a woman instinctively covered her mouth. At the defense table, one of Hawk's junior attorneys dropped his legal pad and didn't pick it up. On the judge's bench, Grayson's knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth slightly as if to object to anything, but no sound came out. He was caught, fully, fatally. Then the next section of the audio played, Hawk's voice again, less polished now. The words clipped, fast, urgent. "She thinks the badge makes her bulletproof." A pause, a faint click in the background, maybe a glass being set down. "Remind her it doesn't." The implication wasn't metaphorical. Then Grayson again, this time whispering, almost pleading, "We'll leak a threat. Nothing serious. Family photos. She'll get the message. She'll back off." That was the moment the courtroom crossed a line. Because bribery could be defended, spun, even buried under legalese. But this was conspiracy. This was stalking. This was calculated psychological warfare against a federal official. And now everyone had heard it. The sound of two men trying to weaponize fear, to make a woman doubt her own safety, her family's safety, just for doing her job. The audio stopped. Static crackled once more, then silence. The silence was even louder than the tape. No one spoke. Not the press, not the lawyers, not the judge. Everyone was looking, either at the projector or at Jasmine. She didn't gloat. She didn't blink. She stood tall, hands folded in front of her voice calm and measured. This is what I've been fighting. Not rumors, not innuendo, but a system that uses power to silence truth. A system that thought it could break me in private, and I brought it into the light. Grayson's breathing grew shallow. His eyes were fixed on the desk. Sweat traced the line of his temple. He looked smaller now, not because he was seated, but because the robe could no longer protect him. For a moment, Judge Grayson looked like a man drowning in his own courtroom. The walls that had once echoed his authority now felt like they were closing in. The words from the recording still rang in everyone's ears. Keep Jasmine quiet, by any means necessary. And now that the truth had been dragged, raw and unfiltered, into the light, Grayson did the only thing a crumbling tyrant knows how to do. He lashed out. With a sharp slam of his gavel, one that cracked through the silence like a pistol shot, he shouted, voice hoarse but full of false confidence. Bailiffs, arrest her. She's in contempt of this court. This is a hijacking of law, of order, of the bench itself. His voice wavered between panic and rage, but his eyes, once commanding, now darted from face to face, searching for someone to back him up. No one did. The bailiffs froze, unsure, caught between the decades-long hierarchy of the courtroom and the new reality burning through the air like fire. Grayson pointed directly at Jasmine. His finger trembled. She has no right to issue evidence without prior judicial review. This is an ambush. This is sedition. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't retreat. She stepped forward slowly and purposefully and let her calm presence destroy every lie trying to hold itself together. Her voice was steady, not loud, but sharpened to a blade. No, Your Honor, what you just heard was treason, not against a party, not against me, against the justice system itself. Then from her blazer pocket she produced the document, a crisp, clean DOJ directive, notarized, date-stamped, signed by the acting attorney general. As she unfolded it with deliberate grace, the cameras clicked in a frenzy. Her every movement was being broadcast live to millions. But Jasmine wasn't playing for drama. She was playing for history. Judge Grayson, she said, raising the document high enough for everyone, even those in the rafters, to see, under Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Federal Code, for acting under the color of law to violate the civil rights of a federal officer and obstructing an active criminal prosecution, I am hereby suspending your judicial authority. Effective immediately. The air turned to glass. No one breathed. Even the reporters, trained to expect anything, were stunned into silence. Jasmine let that silence hang in the air, then delivered the final blow. Justice no longer belongs to you. Grayson staggered back half a step. The gavel slipped from his hand and clattered against the bench. It was a small sound, but in that charged silence, it may as well have been a thunderclap, a symbol of power falling from a man who once thought himself untouchable. A long beat passed. The bailiffs didn't move. Grayson tried again, his voice hollow now, brittle and desperate. She doesn't have that power. I'm a federal judge. But no one was listening anymore. He was talking to ghosts. Then from the rear of the courtroom, the doors flung open with a sharp metallic clap. 3 federal agents stepped inside, wearing dark navy tactical jackets, each one marked clearly, FBI. They moved like precision instruments, fast, alert, decisive. Behind them in a fitted suit and sharp heels came Agent Sarah Clean, her badge displayed prominently, her expression unreadable. She walked in like she'd done this before, because she had, just never with stakes this high. Federal agents, she called out, voice cutting through the static tension. We are executing a lawful suspension and emergency custody order for Judge John Grayson, Under authority of the Department of Justice and U.S. Federal Code Title 18, gas rippled through the room. A woman in the jury box clutched her necklace. A man in the gallery whispered "no way" under his breath. Hawk's lead defense attorney stood frozen, one hand still gripping a pen he hadn't moved in 10 minutes. Reporters locked their cameras toward the bench. One mic light flicked on with a red glow. This was live now. America was watching. Grayson's face went slack. For a second, just one, his entire body seemed to deflate. The robe on his shoulders, once the armor of the powerful, looked suddenly too large, too loose. His mouth opened, then closed again, like a man trying to speak in a dream where his voice wouldn't come. Then his survival instinct kicked in. He spun left, lunging awkwardly for the judge's private exit. The small, locked hallway meant for discretion, not escape. But he was too slow, too rattled. The first agent moved instantly, blocking the exit. The second came in from the side, arms raised in restraint posture. "Judge, stop! Do not resist," he commanded with steel in his tone. But Grayson didn't stop. He grabbed the edge of the bench, as if clinging to it might restore the throne he had just lost. "You can't do this," he cried, his voice cracking like glass under pressure. "I'm a sitting federal judge, appointed for life. This is illegal. This is outrageous. I'll have all of you." But that was as far as he got. The third agent stepped in behind him, grabbed his left wrist, and with clean, controlled force, twisted it behind his back. Grayson winced. The other wrist followed, the metal cuffs sliding into place with a loud, unmistakable click. The courtroom froze. The image was surreal. A judge, still half draped in his robe, now cuffed like a criminal. The robe slipped down one shoulder as he struggled, revealing the sweat-soaked collar of his dress shirt. His breathing was loud, shallow, his eyes now wide with disbelief. He looked out across the room one last time, searching for rescue, for defense, for dignity, and found none. Agent Sarah stepped up beside him, calm, deadly calm. "John Grayson, you are under federal investigation for conspiracy to obstruct justice, bribery, and abuse of authority under color of law. You have the right to remain silent." Grayson muttered something, incoherent, a mix of protest and shame. But no one cared anymore. His words no longer held weight. Then came the walk. They led him down from the bench, not gently, but not roughly either. Just with the unshakable pressure of truth catching up to a man who had spent years hiding behind power. He passed by the jury box, where stunned citizens watched in silence. He passed the prosecution table, where Jasmine Crockett stood like a column of iron, steady, unflinching. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Her silence was louder than any verdict. Grayson refused to look at her. As he reached the doors, the last agent pushed them open with his shoulder, and a wall of camera flashes exploded outside, the light flooding in like judgment itself. Reporters shouted. Microphones pushed forward. The crowd outside surged. But inside, the courtroom remained still. The gavel lay on the floor beneath the bench. The robe hung crooked on the chair. And the man who once sat above the law had just been walked out beneath it. The courtroom victory had barely cooled before the next war began. Jasmine Crockett had just spent 4 hours locked in post-trial meetings with the DOJ's internal affairs team, debriefing federal agents, reviewing evidence chains, and updating the U.S. Marshals on high-risk retaliations. She was exhausted, mentally sharp, but physically running on fumes. Her body ached from tension, her voice was hoarse from testimony, and her inbox was flooded with hate, praise, and everything in between. She didn't leave the courthouse through the front doors. She knew better. Instead, she slipped out the east side service entrance, a quiet, narrow alley typically reserved for staff vehicles. 2 plainclothes agents walked in tight formation beside her. Her armored SUV was parked at the curb, black, unmarked, its tinted windows glinting under the fading DC sun. Jasmine reached for the door handle. That's when it happened. The first shot came like lightning. A sharp, whistling crack split the air, not like the boom of a handgun, but the clean, dry snap of a long-distance rifle. The bullet struck the edge of the side mirror with pinpoint precision, tearing a small metal crater just inches from Jasmine's shoulder. The recoil vibration jolted through the doorframe. The SUV's glass shivered but didn't shatter. Time slowed. The agents dropped immediately. "Shoot her! Shoot her! Go!" one shouted, tackling Jasmine to the ground behind the vehicle. A second shot followed. This one tore through the rear window, spraying tempered fragments across the alley. A third agent, positioned by the SUV's tailgate, returned fire blindly toward the rooftops. Civilians nearby screamed. Two courthouse staffers hit the pavement. Chaos detonated in an instant. Jasmine didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She was already crawling behind the vehicle's rear tire, pulling the agent beside her to cover. The sound of radios crackling, shouts through earpieces, and tactical boots pounding concrete filled the air. Another SUV screeched into position from the far end of the block, its door flying open as backup teams spilled out in Kevlar vests. Inside the car, one bullet had lodged in the dashboard. The other had cracked the bullet-resistant window like a spiderweb. Both shots had been kill shots, head level, heart level, but she was still alive. By the time they got Jasmine out of the alley and into the reinforced convoy, she'd already checked herself for wounds. A minor cut on the cheek, likely from flying glass. Nothing serious, but the message had been clear. This wasn't a warning. This was an execution attempt. 20 minutes later, in a secure FBI substation deep beneath the federal complex, she sat at a cold steel briefing table while Agent Sarah Clean pulled up the feed. Surveillance footage, slow motion frame by frame, one blurry image after another. A rooftop 3 blocks east, a tripod-mounted sniper rifle set against a brick ledge, a figure in black vanishing behind an access door seconds after the shot. "Confirmed," Sarah said quietly. "This wasn't just intimidation. That was a professional. We believe the shooter is tied to a ghost outfit that's been linked to cartel protection work out of Colombia and Eastern Europe. Same gear, same caliber, same signature. We've seen his work before." Jasmine said nothing. She stared at the footage, eyes narrowed, not in shock but calculation, not in fear but in fury. Sarah slid a file across the table. Inside were satellite shots, ballistic reports, field notes. The heading read, "Suspect, Enforcer alias, Sparrow, known contract killer. Status, active." "The last time he pulled a trigger, it was against a judge in Guatemala," Sarah added. "This guy doesn't miss, except today." Jasmine finally leaned back, her voice calm as steel. "Then either he's slipping, or he wanted me alive." Sarah hesitated. "We're not ruling out psychological warfare. Wound her, don't kill her. Make her flinch next time she stands before a court. It's an old trick." Jasmine met her eyes. "Then they picked the wrong woman." She stood up, walked over to the security monitor still playing the moment of impact, the bullet embedding into her SUV's mirror. Her finger traced the screen for a moment. Then she spoke slowly. "I survived Texas. I had to dodge drive-bys in Dallas before I ever saw Harvard Law. I've had gang leaders leave notes on my windshield, DEA agents tell me to back off, and judges dismiss entire fentanyl cases because the defendant wore a suit." She turned back to Sarah. "I've seen worse, and I'm still standing. So if someone thought I'd crawl under a desk because they missed twice," she paused, "tell them next time they better bring a war." The corridors of Capitol Hill hadn't felt this tense since the last impeachment inquiry. The air was stiff with suits, microphones, and anticipation. Inside the Senate hearing room, every seat was filled. Spectators lined the walls. Press cameras buzzed quietly on tripods, their red live lights glowing like watchful eyes. Behind the horseshoe-shaped dais, rows of senators waited, dressed in power, but fidgeting in silence. At the center sat Senator Robert Callahan, chairman of the Judiciary Oversight Committee. Silver hair, measured voice, a reputation for civility, but a spine greased by political favors. He tapped the gavel once, and the room stilled. "This hearing," he began, "has been called to determine whether White House counsel Jasmine Crockett committed a breach of constitutional authority by suspending a sitting federal judge, John Grayson, during an active trial." On paper, it sounded noble, orderly, serious, but everyone in the room knew what it really was, a hit job in a suit. For 2 days straight, conservative outlets had blasted Jasmine with op-eds calling her a rogue attorney, a political extremist, even a deep state operative. Social media swarmed with doctored videos. A handful of senators whispered, without evidence, that she had ties to radical organizations. The aim was simple: make her too radioactive to lead, then remove her on process. But Jasmine had come armed with fire. She sat alone at the witness table, shoulders square, eyes unblinking. The only sound was the soft click of her briefcase opening. She didn't look up as she spoke. "I'll waive my opening statement, Mr. Chairman." Callahan raised a brow. "You're sure?" She met his eyes for the first time and smiled. "I think it's better if we hear yours first." Then, without another word, she slid a slim USB stick across the polished wood toward the nearest staffer. "Play the file marked March 4th, Callahan Hawk." There was a beat of confusion, then a flicker of movement as the staffer looked to Callahan for permission. He hesitated, but Jasmine's voice, calm but resolute, cut in before he could speak. "This body prides itself on transparency. I suggest we start today." And just like that, the playback began. The room turned into a tomb as Victor Hawk's voice oozed from the speakers. "She's dangerous. You've got the committee. Make it look legal. Frame it like she overstepped. I'll take care of the rest." Then unmistakably, Senator Callahan's own voice followed. "I can orchestrate the optics. We'll emphasize process violations. Paint her as emotionally unstable. The press will eat it up." Dead silence. Every phone in the room lit up. Reporters turned to each other, eyes wide. One aide sprinted to a side door with their phone pressed to their ear. A woman in the back audibly gasped. The gavel trembled in Callahan's hand, his face pale, sweat forming at his temples. But Jasmine didn't stop there. She reached again into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. Thick, official, marked with the Department of Justice seal. "This," she said, lifting the stack, "is a certified audit trail showing financial transactions from Hawk Enterprises shadow firms to 13 members of this legislative body." She placed the folder on the table. "Wire transfers, super PACs, personal accounts, all routed within the last 2 election cycles." Gasps erupted. Several senators shifted in their seats. One stood up and left. Callahan opened his mouth, but Jasmine's voice, ice wrapped in fire, shut the room down. "You came for me because I threatened the comfort of your corruption. You thought you could use this chamber to discredit me? What you didn't count on is that I brought receipts." Her gaze moved across the room, sweeping from left to right like a lighthouse beam during a storm. She wasn't speaking just to the panel anymore. She was speaking to the people, the cameras, the generations watching. "I didn't suspend a judge to show power. I did it to stop a man from selling justice to a crime syndicate. And if this chamber truly believes that's misconduct, then maybe it's this chamber that needs reform, not me." Callahan, still frozen, finally pounded his gavel. "This hearing is out of order." Jasmine leaned forward. "No, Senator. This hearing is finally in order." Reporters surged toward the exit. The press was already pushing out headlines. "Jasmine exposes congressional corruption live. Senator Callahan tied to Victor Hawk. Crockett's counterattack rocks Capitol." Then came the final move, the vote. But they didn't dare take it. No senator wanted their name on the record supporting a corrupted judge or a media-manipulated witch hunt. Not after what had just been revealed. One by one, the committee members leaned back, checked their notes, and fell into silence. They knew. She'd won. Not just the room, the war. The trial of United States versus John Grayson and Victor Hawk wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was the final chapter of an American nightmare. For weeks, the nation had been glued to their screens. This wasn't a scandal hidden in footnotes or whispered in policy circles. This was justice standing eye to eye with power and daring it to blink. Courtroom sketches were on the covers of magazines. College classes paused to stream testimony. Even hardened political anchors sat quietly, eyes fixed on every detail of the live feed. Jasmine Crockett had brought them here. Now she sat quietly in the first row of the gallery, behind the prosecution table. No cameras on her, no podium, just presence. She wasn't there to perform, she was there to witness. And the first to fall was Judge John Grayson. The man who once held court in that very building now entered in shackles, wearing a thin correctional jumpsuit, his eyes sunken into the hollow of his guilt. There was no press conference, no statement of innocence, no fire in his eyes. Only resignation and a slow, almost robotic nod as he took the stand to enter his plea. "How do you plead to the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice?" the judge asked. A silence stretched, so long it felt unnatural. Then, "Guilty." The word didn't echo. It sank, like a stone dropped into a still lake. Jasmine looked at him, just once, not with revenge, not with anger, but with a knowing quiet, the kind only someone who's seen a man become his crime can carry. Grayson didn't return her look. He stared at the floor like it might open up and take him away. But the storm was still gathering, and its name was Victor Hawk. He entered not like a man defeated, but like one still holding on to the illusion of command. Black tailored suit, silver cufflinks. His lawyers surrounded him like armor. He didn't shuffle. He strode to his seat, shoulders back, jaw tight. But no amount of posture could protect him from what was coming. The prosecution presented wire records. $2 million transferred 12 hours after the sniper attempt on Jasmine's life. The money had come from a shell company under Hawk Enterprises, routed through Zurich, landed in a private account belonging to a known cartel hitman connected to 3 political assassinations overseas. Sarah Clean stood to deliver the evidence herself, calm, forensic, surgical. "There is no business justification, no contract, no traceable service," she testified. "There is only this payment, $2 million, from Victor Hawk's network to a man who fired 2 shots at federal counsel Jasmine Crockett." The courtroom didn't breathe. Then came the audio. Not from a courtroom, not from a wiretap, but from a boardroom, recorded during a meeting Jasmine's team had infiltrated months ago. Hawk's voice was cold, measured, certain. "She doesn't get rattled, so rattle the people around her, send a message. And if she still won't fold, well, everyone breaks eventually." The room cracked open like a fault line. One juror put her hand over her mouth. Reporters typed so fast the keys clicked like gunfire. Hawk's defense attorney tried to object, but the judge didn't even entertain it. Jasmine sat unmoving. Her hands were clasped, her eyes locked straight ahead. But her posture carried a charge, the quiet power of someone who had taken every hit, every smear, every bullet and still stood. Now the courtroom stood with her. On sentencing day, Grayson's fate was handed down first. 20 years. Federal prison, no parole. He didn't protest. He didn't speak. Just nodded once before 2 marshals took him away. As he passed Jasmine, he paused, not long, but just enough to glance up. Not to ask for forgiveness, just to acknowledge. She gave him nothing. Then came Hawk. The judge didn't rush. She read each charge slowly, carefully, as if to weigh each word against every life lost to fentanyl, every cop paid off, every silent death in a backroom deal. The courtroom was dead quiet. For the crimes of conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, bribery, and trafficking, the judge said, eyes locked on Hawk, "You are hereby sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole." For the first time, Victor Hawk moved. His jaw twitched. His fingers flexed once, and though his lips didn't part, his eyes flickered with the truth he had spent a lifetime denying. He was no longer untouchable. As the cuffs clicked into place, he turned to Jasmine, not with hate, not with rage, but with the hollow gaze of a man finally stripped bare. She didn't rise, she didn't gloat. She whispered only to herself, "Let the dead bury the dead." Then she stood, turned her back on both men, and walked out of the courtroom into sunlight. The marble steps of the federal courthouse were wet with rain, glistening under a dull slate sky. Washington was unusually silent for a city that rarely slept. Streets that just days ago had been buzzing with sirens, motorcades, and angry chants now waited, still and watchful. And on those steps, behind a narrow steel podium, branded with the seal of the Department of Justice, stood Jasmine Crockett. Her presence was unshakable. No teleprompter, no aide at her side, no talking points taped beneath the lens. Just her, standing with her feet square, shoulders back, coat unbuttoned in the chill, and eyes locked on the rows of journalists that lined the plaza like sentries of truth or vultures of power, depending on where they'd stood during the trial. The air buzzed with the tension of 100 unspoken questions. Would she gloat? Would she resign? Would she retreat? Instead, she leaned toward the microphone, her breath visible in the cold, and spoke like she was talking to the entire country. Not in volume, but in gravity. "This isn't a victory I celebrate," she said slowly, voice resonant and plain. "Because this victory came too late for the families who buried their sons. Too late for the whistleblowers whose careers were destroyed. Too late for the prosecutors who were silenced, transferred, or buried in paperwork until they gave up." A pause. "This isn't my win. It belongs to the people who stood when I couldn't, who believed when others folded, and who trusted that the system, broken as it is, could still respond to truth." Flashes lit up the plaza. Camera crews leaned in closer. A CNN producer whispered something urgent into her earpiece. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Her hands never left the podium. Her fingers curled slightly around the edges, not out of fear, but to anchor herself to the moment, to history. "They came after me with everything they had," she continued. "Disinformation, political hearings, a sniper rifle. And when that didn't work, they came after your belief in me." She scanned the crowd. Her eyes passed over press, over officials, over ordinary citizens huddled in the back with makeshift signs and trembling hope. "But I'm still here, not because I'm stronger than them, but because I'm not alone." Now her voice deepened, slow and deliberate. "This is a message to every American who's ever been told, you can't fight that. You can, and you must. Because the truth may not arrive with a motorcade, it may not come dressed in a robe, it may not speak in polished sentences, but it doesn't break, and it doesn't bleed. And when it stands up, even if it's shaking, the walls of corruption start to fall." The plaza was still. The cameras were silent. Even the birds had stopped. "They told me I was too loud, too angry, too ambitious, too dangerous. But what they were really afraid of was that I wouldn't stop." She leaned closer, not to whisper, but to make sure every syllable landed. "And I won't." Then she stepped back. No dramatic flourish, no triumphant smile, just a nod, as if to say, "We're not done yet." The applause didn't come right away. The crowd didn't know what to do with silence that heavy. But then a single voice called out from the back, "Thank you, Jasmine." Then another, and another. And then the roar began. Reporters jostled forward, microphones lunged toward her. But she turned, walked calmly down the steps, and disappeared into the black SUV waiting at the curb. No guards around her, no crowd control needed. She had already shown them the strongest defense wasn't the gun or the gavel. It was the truth, spoken with nothing but breath and backbone. The crowds had gone home. The courtroom echoes faded into memory. Flashbulbs no longer chased her down the marble steps. But in the quiet hours after the trial of the century, Washington, D.C. returned to its most dangerous state. Calm. It was just past midnight. Inside her office on the 6th floor of the Justice Department, Jasmine Crockett sat at her desk, alone, lit only by the warm glow of a desk lamp. Outside the window, the city sprawled in tense stillness. The Capitol dome lit like a watchful eye against the darkness. Her navy blazer hung neatly on a coat rack. Her tie was loosened. Her heels sat on the floor beneath her chair. Her bare feet rested on the cold wood, a small reminder that for all the history she'd just changed, she was still human, still breathing. Stacks of files surrounded her. Sealed warrants, financial records, digital forensics. The last 2 months were etched into every page, every bullet point, every corner of the broken system she had dared to challenge. A manila envelope rested at the center of her desk, a summary of the final sentencing order against Grayson and Hawk. She hadn't opened it yet. She didn't need to. The gavel had already fallen. But something else arrived that night. A low knock echoed on the glass pane of her office door. She looked up, not startled, just alert. It was Agent Sarah Clean, tired, dust on her blazer, a manila envelope in hand. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. It's after midnight. Sarah stepped in, shutting the door behind her. She didn't smile. She placed the envelope on the desk in silence. Jasmine noticed immediately. It was different. Smaller. No return address, no official stamp. Just her name, typed, all caps, and nothing else. Jasmine didn't speak. She reached for a latex glove from the drawer, second nature now, and peeled the envelope open with surgical care. Inside was a single sheet of plain white paper, no signature, no emblem, no postmark, just 7 words scrawled across the center in sharp, erratic ink. We're not done with you yet. The silence in the room grew heavier. The fluorescent hum of the hallway light buzzed like static behind the door. Sarah leaned forward, voice low. This came through the internal drop chute. No cameras, no prints. It was placed there in the last 30 minutes. Jasmine read the words again, slowly, deliberately, then folded the page and slid it into an evidence bag. She exhaled through her nose. Not with fear, with recognition. They never learn, she said. Sarah crossed her arms. We'll run it through the handwriting database. Check local surveillance. But you know what this means. Jasmine stood slowly, walked to the window, looked out at the National Mall, the white pillars, the floodlit monuments, the illusion of peace. It means the system's bigger than 2 men, she said. It means Grayson and Hawk weren't the last. They were just the ones who got sloppy. Sarah stepped closer. This could be a bluff, a scare tactic. Jasmine turned to her, smiling faintly. Not amused, not smug, sharp, focused. I don't care if it's a bluff, she said. What matters is someone still believes they can scare me into silence. She walked back to her desk, grabbed her coat and slid her arms into the sleeves with mechanical precision. Her body moved with a rhythm born not of habit, but preparation, as if she'd been waiting for this moment, as if she knew it would come. I've spent years cleaning up other people's messes, she said, buttoning the coat. Now it's time I start digging where no one wants to look. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You're talking about going deeper? Jasmine didn't hesitate. I want every transaction Hawk Enterprises touched in the last 5 years. Corporate clients, PAC donations, offshore shells. I want sealed cases reopened. I want to know who in this building, and on the Hill, still thinks they're untouchable. Sarah nodded, the ghost of a smile appearing on her face. You know you're going to war again. Jasmine's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the Capitol, toward the shadows that still moved behind the curtain of legitimacy. No, she said. I never stopped. She grabbed the evidence bag and held it up between her fingers like a declaration of war. This isn't a warning, she said, voice firm. This is permission. Sarah tilted her head. Permission to do what? Jasmine's smile returned, sharper this time. To start the next chapter. She tossed the bag onto her desk and turned toward the door. Her posture was loose, but her steps were loaded with intent. She didn't ask for backup. She didn't wait for approval. She didn't even glance at the security monitors as she walked past them, because the message hadn't changed her. It had only reminded her of why she started. And as she disappeared into the dim hallway, the only sound left in the room was the soft flutter of the threat letter inside its plastic sleeve. Lifeless, powerless, irrelevant. For those who tried to silence her, it was a warning. But for Jasmine Crockett, it was a spark, a promise, a dare. And she was already writing her answer. The letter didn't shake her, it awakened her. As Jasmine Crockett stepped once more into the darkness beyond her office, carrying a fresh threat in her hand and an old fire in her chest, she understood something that few in Washington dared to accept out loud. The trial might be over, but the war for justice never ends. Not in a city where truth was treated like a commodity. Not in a world where influence was bought in briefcases and sold in backroom whispers. Not in a country where even the bench could be rented for the right price. Because when justice is sold, no one is safe. Not the journalist, not the whistleblower, not the prosecutor, not the citizen watching from the sidelines, hoping the laws on the books are the ones being followed, and certainly not the person brave enough to stand up. Jasmine knew that now more than ever. She had faced a system designed to grind people like her into silence. And not just her. The list stretched far beyond the courtroom. Frank Serpico, bleeding out on a dirty hallway floor in Brooklyn after exposing NYPD corruption. Edward Snowden, cast into exile for daring to show the world how its own government watches without blinking. Daphne Caruana, Galizia, the Maltese journalist who died when her car exploded. All because she followed a trail of dirty money too far up the chain. They weren't reckless. They weren't naive. They were brave. And bravery in a world wired for obedience is a dangerous thing. Jasmine hadn't set out to be a hero. She was a lawyer, trained in procedure, bound by precedent, committed to law. But law without truth is theater. And in that federal courtroom, she refused to play the role they wrote for her. Silent, decorative, obedient. She was none of those things. Not when families were burying children lost to fentanyl. Not when judges were taking payouts to protect killers in suits. Not when her own life was put on a sniper's crosshairs just for doing her job. And that's the warning buried inside this story. The battle Jasmine fought isn't fiction. It's a mirror, a reflection of a world where power is rarely punished, and truth-tellers are often left standing alone. She stood because others couldn't, or wouldn't, or had already been buried, in paperwork, in debt, in fear. What saved her wasn't immunity. It wasn't title. It wasn't government badges. It was conviction. Conviction that no matter how expensive it was, truth had value. That no matter how dangerous it became, justice still mattered. And that no matter how loud the lies got, one steady voice could still cut through. But that voice doesn't echo on its own. It needs others. Because the real message isn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It's about the world you live in. The one where headlines can be bought, where surveillance is spun as safety, where the powerful call transparency a threat. In that world, the truth becomes a burden, something too heavy for most to carry. And so we don't. We scroll past it. We laugh at it. We say, that's politics. We say, it doesn't matter. But it does. It matters because the system only breaks when no one is watching. It matters because silence is not the same as peace. And it matters because people like Jasmine, or Serpico, or Snowden, or Galizia can't stand forever on their own. They need you, not to be perfect, not to risk everything, but to care, to notice, to ask, to listen, to stop believing that integrity is weakness and that fear is a virtue, because it's not. The story you just witnessed, it's more than drama. It's a warning. The real threat isn't the gun, it's the indifference. The danger isn't always a man with a plan. Sometimes it's a crowd with no memory, a system that forgets how easily freedom erodes when truth is no longer defended. Jasmine didn't just fight to win a case. She fought to remind us what the law is supposed to be. A shield for the vulnerable, not a weapon for the wealthy. And now, even after the verdict, even after the applause, she knows more threats will come. More letters, more headlines, more shadows. But she won't stop, because truth doesn't stop. So when the time comes, when another system shakes, when another voice trembles in court, when another letter arrives with a promise of fear, ask yourself, what would you do? Would you look away or would you stand? Because at the end of every courtroom fight, every leak, every whistle, every truth too inconvenient to stay buried, there's only ever one question that matters. Will someone be brave enough to keep going? Jasmine was. Will you be? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.